Well, hello. We welcome you, Dr. Elizabeth and I, Rick Chrisman, welcome you back to our dialogue about The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, which we're enjoying a lot. And actually, we have a couple of recruits, Elizabeth, that I've been told of by two people, that they've got the book because
Oh,
of
yay.
our dialogues here. So that's
That's great
fun.
news.
And we'll pick up the conversation with them in person. And one of them said expressly that it's so well written and it's a very constructive approach uh,
Hmm.
that Heather McGhee does. So we're in the seventh chapter, Living Apart. So she's talking about segregation
Hmm.
and how that has impacted not only Blacks, of course, but the cost to whites personally and economically. So,
Hmm.
where do we want to jump in? Um, you spoke about your personal experience of having moved to the Boston area.
Hmm. When we moved to Boston from upstate New York in 1972, which was at the height of the busing desegregation orders in Boston. And it was loud and it was nasty and it was violent. The woman who was the sort of preeminent organizer of the opposition's name was Louisa Day Hicks, and she was a Boston City councilwoman. And while her children went to private school, a Roman Catholic private school, um, she was pitting Irish American workers, citizens who had historically not been treated very well in Boston against the Black community. And so rather than look at what they had in common and why the schools were an issue, because they were an issue for the Irish Americans as much as they were for the Blacks in different ways. Um, segregation was both de facto and de jure. And it was awful. It was violent and it was constant people yelling on television about it.
You know, as you were speaking, I was remembering that I had read a book in the mid 70s, or I don't know when the busing issue cooled off enough for someone to write a book called Common Ground.
Kevin White was the mayor of Boston.
Right. Was he the author of that?
Yes, he was.
And
He
it
was.
it was a searing story and, a bitter conflict
Hmm.
for the whole city and beyond because the suburbs were caught up in the same issue.
Hmm.
But the root of all this has to do with where people live. She talked about living apart,
Hmm.
therefore their schooling apart. And for our society, for Americans, it was for white Americans, it was clear they just didn't want to go to school with that was predominantly Black. And the root of that goes back to the way public education is funded in the United
Hmm.
States compared with other countries. And schools are funded by local municipalities based on real estate taxes. So, if you're living in Boston, it's your real estate taxes that pay for schooling there. And in Newton, you're doing the same thing. And the tax base, of course, makes it possible for Newton schools to have a lot more money to spend per student. Apart from just the fact that they're, separating the races, you're privileging, to use an important word here,
Hmm.
the white students because they live in more affluent places. And I've always thought that if we could just change that, if you wanted to do something for reparations, it would be to change that law. But
Hmm.
it would take 25 years before the effects of more financing could be felt.
Well, that's one of the interesting points that she raises that I don't think um, a lot of people realize. And the town that I live in, that I've lived in since 1972, Was not well known when we moved in. It was like the Westwood was the last acceptable bedroom community to live in. But we always had an excellent school system. And I'm a product of that system. Both my children are products of that system, and we got an excellent education. And as the reputation of the town grew, our property taxes have gone through the roof. They have tripled in the last 8 years. And, yes, we have an incredible school system here. But, people who grew up here, who've lived here all their lives, who are retired now, they're moving out of town because they can't afford the property taxes.
And what does that money buy in the schools? In public schools today, everything is focused on better scores, and scores do not a better education make. And one of Heather McGee's points is that the cost to whites of segregated schooling is the tremendous cultural deficit that whites have in cultural competency. And this is extremely important, not just as for the personal enrichment, cultural enrichment of every child growing up, to understand diversity and to experience diversity firsthand. It affects the work life,
Absolutely.
to professional life, or even wherever you may work. Diversity is a reality, and higher scores don't help you with that.
No, they don't. And I did not really experience a diverse population until I went to college. And, I went to Washington, D.C., where not only did we have a lot of different ethnic groups, the basketball team was all Black, but it was the school I went to at Georgetown. We had international students from all over the world. They were sufficient. I mean, they were a large part of the population. And it really wasn't until I got into that setting that I realized how limited my perspective was and how much I had lost because I didn't know other people's stories.
I have a similar story to tell because I went to a rural high school in Illinois. You can imagine that was all white, except for one Black family. But I went then to college. I'm so old that I went to a college that was all male. It was not co-ed, and had one Black student, one African American student. But then I did choose to go to graduate school at the University of Chicago Divinity School, which is on the south side of Chicago, about which Heather McGee writes extensively in the book and in this chapter. And the great benefit there that I saw instantly, and I knew about it prior to going, of course, was that theology there was not done in a vacuum, in a social vacuum, in a societal vacuum, because Hyde Park, where the university is on the south side, is integrated and very diverse, but it's surrounded by the poorest neighborhoods of Chicago, which of course are segregated de facto. And so it was a great education. Two of my professors and their families lived in a housing complex in Woodlawn. They were both ethics professors, actually, as a matter of fact, and for the very reason that they wanted to diversify their head in doing their theological work.
I recall a story that you have told about your first experience preaching in a Black church, which I think was during that period of time in your life.
Right. It was, well, the shock for me was due to my lack of exposure to African-American life, which is so rich. I mean, after that, I subsequently spent a lot of time in Black churches, both in the South Side of Chicago and elsewhere. I also served a church for 4 years in South Central Los Angeles in the Crenshaw district, which is where the Rodney King incident took place. Not at that time, but nevertheless, there I was in a church that was 50-50 Black and white. And Heather McGee is so right that it is an unmeasurable loss to white culture to keep playing this game of keep away and stay away.
Well, and the one thing, she talks about this in terms of education. She talks about this in terms of housing, but she doesn't talk about the religious segregation.
No, she doesn't, does she? Well, we could say words about that. There's Martin Luther King was famous for saying that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week. And that is true, but also as a literary person, forgive me for bringing that in, but it's so interesting that each society, each community has its own poetry. And the poetry of the Black church, I will say, is very rich. I mean, compared to our we're, Protestants, white Protestants are, it's largely a head trip for most, unless you're in the Pentecostal channel. But there is a great, it's like the service comes in 4 dimensions because of the language. And so the language forms a kind of barrier. I know that was true in this church I served in Los Angeles. The only reason the African Americans told me, the only reason they were in a white church, or what was formerly a white church, is because they wanted to go to a 60-minute service.
Oh, Lord.
As opposed to the 2 hours. But I went to plenty of 2-hour services and I wasn't looking at my watch. They're so rich.
I did my MDiv and my DMin at Episcopal Divinity School, which, while it was in existence, it was the bastion of radical everything in the Episcopal Church. And what I learned from Black womanist theologians and Latin mujeristas, and I had an amazing professor who was from Hong Kong, and who has done a huge amount about colonial liberation theology in the last 10 years. And the perspectives, white Protestants, particularly in the tradition I grew up in, are nicknamed God's frozen chosen, because we're so heady and so non-emotional. And for the most part, in this particular country, our life experiences are not such that we need to depend on God in the way our Black brothers and sisters do, or our Latinx brothers and sisters do. And to see the way their lived experience changes their theology and makes demands on their theology, on things that it would never have occurred to me to think about had I not been exposed to them.
Well, if we could only figure out a way to diversify our own experience right away, right here in this church and this community, we experience it. Those of us who seek it out can still do it online, which I know you and I do. But how I think it is an imperative for us to not just be talking, you and me, good as that might be, about these subjects, but figure out a way to diversify our religious experience, our racial experience at the religious level.
Well, and particularly to build relationships. I'm always cautious when I'm going into a tradition that is not my own, which I have done a lot of. It's not performance. It's not, something you go to watch to get a different perspective. It's the relationships that you build
Right.
within the communities that changed things.
Yep. Well, we have to work on that. We need to commit ourselves to this, recommit ourselves to it. We believe in it. She says, Heather McGee does in this chapter, that whites say they want the diversity, but they don't choose it.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to housing and when it comes to schooling, that polls have showed, they've verified, they've documented the fact that whites do believe in diversity. They say they believe in it, and yet the figures show that they don't choose it. And churches could have a bigger role in diversifying white people's experience if we could, find the key programmatic way to do that. So maybe that's a conversation you and I can have offline and come back another day, because we're about to run out of time for this chapter. Do you have any stray thoughts you still want to share?
Well, we always ask, what did we learn that we didn't know before? Now, I knew this, but I only knew this because I recently read Isabel Wilkerson's Cast.
Oh,
But the Jim Crow segregation laws were what the Nuremberg laws were built on to prosecute the Jews.
wow. Sobering.
Yeah. I mean, that the United States, who we want to think of as this, bastion of liberty and freedom and honoring everybody's rights, we were the boilerplate for the law in Germany that led to the death of 6 million Jews, gay folks, gypsies, pastors.
Right. We were a model for the Third Reich. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
It's not in the history books that they have in the textbooks, I'm afraid. And the other thing we do usually, Elizabeth, is to try and remember a special phrase or word that Heather McGee uses. Mine for this week is the one she uses when she says untapped potential.
Mm-hmm.
Untapped potential of diversity and integration, and it's a great loss, and we should contemplate the gains and commit ourselves to restoring them.
Amen.
Let us conclude for today, for this week, and we'll come back again for another chapter called The Same Sky. And I haven't gotten that far in the book, so I better get cracking. All right.
All right.
See you next
Blessings
time.
all.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.